A bill that bars the courts from halting the production or sale of genetically modified foods, even if they're found to be hazardous to our health. So why did US President Barack Obama sign what's known as the Monsanto Protection Act into law? And the new advertising campaign in New York that calls Israel's treatment of the Palestinians apartheid. But is the US public ready to hear the Palestinian narrative? You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihab Ratansi. It can be difficult to make an informed judgment on the safety of genetically modified organisms, or GMOs, such as the impassioned reaction that greets each new study. At the very least, though, there is general agreement that much more research is required on a case-by-case basis into any potential health risks of GMOs. With that in mind, the European Union has strict controls over their use while doubts persist. But here in the US, President Barack Obama last week approved a law giving the production and sale of GMOs and genetically engineered crops immunity from court intervention, even if health risks do emerge. Food safety campaigners have dubbed it the Monsanto Protection Act, and they're heavily criticizing not only the president, but the US Congress, which they say failed to scrutinize the language of the bill, which is reportedly crafted in collusion with Monsanto to be deliberately opaque. Joining me to discuss this are from Austin, Texas, Tom Philpott, the food and agriculture correspondent for Mother Jones magazine. And here in the studio, Colin O'Neill, Director of Government Affairs at the Center for Food Safety. We did ask for a Monsanto representative to join us on the program, but they declined, although we do have a statement which we'll read out a bit later. But first, let's take a closer look at what opponents are calling the biotech rider that was included in this legislation. More formally, it's Section 735 of the H.R. 933 spending bill. It was now reportedly written by Republican Senator Roy Blunt in close collusion with Monsanto. We might go into some of that in a moment. The company gave more than $60,000, or has given more than $60,000 to Blunt's campaign over the past 5 years. And campaigners say the language of the bill is deliberately opaque, and many members of Congress are said to have been unaware of the provision as they were voting on it. But I guess we can judge for ourselves. Now, here it is. Quote, "The Secretary of Agriculture shall, notwithstanding any other provision of law upon request by a farmer, grower, farm operator, or producer, immediately grant temporary permits or temporary deregulation in part, subject to necessary and appropriate conditions consistent with Section 411A or 412C of the Plant Protection Act, which interim conditions shall authorize the movement, introduction, continued cultivation, commercialization, and other specifically enumerated activities and requirements, including measures designed to mitigate or minimize potential adverse environmental effects, if any, relevant to the Secretary's evaluation of the petition for non-regulated status, while ensuring that growers or other users are able to move, plant, cultivate, introduce into commerce, and carry out other authorized activities in a timely manner." Tom Philpott, why is that so concerning?
Well, what this is really about is sort of ensuring that the USDA doesn't do rigorous environmental studies, impact studies of novel GMO crops. Starting in the mid-90s, when these crops started to come out, the USDA was approving them one after the other. Roundup-ready crops engineered to withstand Roundup herbicide, BT crops engineered to express the BT toxic gene, insecticide, over and over again, permitting these crops without doing really extensive environmental impact statements. And in the mid-2000s, a coalition of environmental groups started to sue the USDA, arguing that under the National Environmental Protection Act, they had to do these environmental impact statements. And they succeeded in blocking, at least temporarily, two major GMO crops, Roundup-ready alfalfa and Roundup-ready sugar beets. So what I think is going on here is that the industry is trying really hard to prevent that from happening again. Even if a judge rules that the USDA has improperly approved these crops, what this provision states is that the USDA has to permit their planting anyway. So really, I mean, I think it's a pretty clear case of checks and balances of government being overturned.
But just to be clear, Colin, Monsanto and other biotech companies, is pretty important perhaps to emphasize, this isn't just about Monsanto.
Sure.
But they can still be prosecuted and they can still undergo judicial proceedings. It's just during that time when, for example, the potential safety of a crop is being adjudicated, those crops can still be planted and harvested and
Yeah. What federal courts have done when they've struck down an approval of a USDA approval, they've said that there could be environmental or economic harms to farmers or the environment, and they've essentially recognized that harm and capped that harm. This backdoor rider really just removes that cap. It removes federal courts of putting in place any measures that would safeguard farmers and the environment, essentially allows for Monsanto or any other corporation to continue selling these crops.
So it's not just during any judicial proceedings that might be underway, but even if at the end of a judicial proceeding the crop is found to be damaging, then?
The way this rider is written, it appears to stop after that judicial order is done.
Right.
But in that interim period, it allows companies to continue to sell their products.
Just on a side issue, though, I mean, there was some confusion about where this rider came from, but now various outlets, Tom, are suggesting it was Roy Blunt who introduced it. I mean, do we know? I mean, it's pretty astonishing, though, I guess, that these anonymous riders can suddenly appear in legislation. Is that just taken as part of the normal democratic process, though?
I was a bit stunned by that last week when I dug into it, and I called. I heard rumors about several different senators possibly being the origin of it, and no one would talk to me. Even Senator Tester, senator from Montana, who had an amendment proposal to block this rider, he had no idea where it came from, and it's just this this odd twist when you get these sort of last-minute bills to continue government, that a lot of stuff gets thrown in and no one takes responsibility for it. And I think this is a classic example of that.
Although, I mean, defenders of the president would say, look, he didn't have a line item veto over this. He couldn't have just sort of removed that. This was about funding the government, from another one of these relatively arbitrary deadlines. And so, I mean, he didn't really have much choice. Is that a fair argument on President Obama's behalf?
That's correct. Signing this bill into law in no way indicates President Obama supports these backdoor, hostage-style negotiations. This is special interest politics and business as usual riders in must-pass legislation. The special interest behind these riders knew that the president had to sign this bill into law.
Right. And so this is what Monsanto said to us. We did ask them for some sort of comment to the various allegations that this might eventually put our health and our environment at risk. They pointed to the last time this rider came up, which is actually as part of the farmer assurance provision signed in the House Agricultural Spending Bill last year. So Monsanto pointed us to a statement that they released when that came out, which is, quote, "The inclusion of Section 733 is a positive step to ensure U.S. farmers and our food chain are shielded from supply disruptions caused by litigation over procedural issues unrelated to sound science or the safety of biotech crops. This legislative solution ensures that national agricultural policy is not being decided by the court system while providing a level of certainty that is critical to ensure that our agricultural producers continue to lead the world." So I guess, Tom, the suggestion is that these sort of frivolous lawsuits that could put our food supply in danger, I guess, is the argument that I'm getting from there.
Yeah, I mean, that's what they're saying, but I think that it's pretty appalling when you consider the crop in question. The crops in question in the past have been these Roundup-ready crops, and we've known for several years now that the net impact of Roundup-ready crops, and we're talking about tens of millions of acres of corn and soy and cotton, now alfalfa and sugar beets, in this technology, has caused this incredible upsurge in herbicide use, first of all, and second of all, in weeds that have developed resistance to this herbicide. Because if you, year after year, use the same herbicides, simple evolution will tell you that weeds are going to develop resistance to it. So you got these resistant weeds basically galloping through the Midwest and the South, in cotton country in the South, and you've got this sort of gusher of herbicides coming down, and the tendency is to roll out more and more of these crops. What's pending now in the USDA are corn and soy products that are resistant to not just Roundup, but to second more toxic herbicides. And I think this is really what this push is about, this next generation of herbicide-resistant technology. And the idea that there shouldn't be rigorous environmental review, that the USDA shouldn't be held accountable by the court system to partake of these rigorous reviews is just ridiculous. And I think that, just on the basis alone of herbicide-resistant weeds, of increased use of toxic herbicides, I think it's just outrageous that they've managed to get this special protection. I
suppose given the nature of these crops, once you start planting them, then it's kind of too late. I mean, so I guess this is why it might just be for 6 months, or it might just be, the point is the period in which potentially a court could stop these crops from being planted is pretty crucial, because once they've been planted, it's too late to go back. I think that's what I'm going for. Okay.
Yep.
As far as superweeds are concerned, I mean, is there any suggestion that this new generation has finally cracked it, that this isn't just the endless cycle of, getting ever stronger herbicides and pesticides, then leading to ever stronger superweeds? Or I mean, have they finally cracked it? Do we think now that?
This is what we, and certainly Tom has referred to in the past, as just the pesticide treadmill.
Right.
That this is industry's response with their same tools. Industry can't respond with one herbicide. In this case, 2,4-D, which is one of the components in Agent Orange, carries a number of potential health harms. That's the industry's response to Roundup resistance in the weeds. We see 60 million acres of farmland in the U.S. infested with herbicide-resistant weeds. What we're going to get with 2,4-D corn, 2,4-D soy, is weeds that are resistant to both Roundup and 2,4-D, and they're going to need a newer, or in this case, older, more toxic herbicide to deal with that resistance.
Are there, I mean, I suppose the argument there usually, Tom, is that the potential benefits of these sorts of crops outweighs any of those potential problems, and in fact that we shouldn't have any reason to feel that Monsanto and the other companies, the Dows and the DuPonts, wouldn't be as concerned about some of these issues as you are. And so they're keeping a close watch of this, as are the FDA and other government agencies.
Well, unfortunately, the USDA, when it was forced to do those impact statements for alfalfa and sugar beets, they acknowledged the resistance problem. And the resistance problem, it does accelerate the treadmill. And here's I think the irony of it is that if you're Monsanto, the failure of your crop is a business opportunity, because first of all, if your crop starts to fail as a farmer, if your Roundup Ready soybeans are suddenly infested with weeds, your response is to buy more herbicides, and the same companies that control the seed industry also control the majority of the pesticide industry and the herbicide industry. And the second thing is, if they can successfully push through these crops, these next generation double herbicide resistant crops, they can charge more money for them because it's a new product, and they will literally be selling more herbicides. And so they've sort of rigged this game up where they've turned failure into a business model. And I think that, getting basically scaring the USDA off from doing environmental impact statements is a great tool in their kit.
Is there any real debate about this anymore, Colin, though, about cross-pollination, about superweeds, about Monsanto genetic material appearing in seeds that theoretically weren't Monsanto? I mean, is there an argument that isn't happening, or is anyone even trying to make that argument?
No, and frankly, the industry has really shied away from that issue. In 2006, we saw widespread contamination of U.S. rice. An unapproved experimental rice variety called Liberty Link rice contaminated wide swaths of U.S. farmland. That led to over $1 billion in economic damages. The EU, Japan shut down imports of U.S. rice for fear of this contamination. Rice farmers had to go to court, ultimately settled for a large amount of money, but it resulted in a lot of people getting pushed out of business. We fear that this rider, which would allow this kind of backdoor commercialization while the USDA is assessing these risks, could cause the next Liberty Link rice.
So, I mean, the evidence of environmental impact seems pretty large, but where things seem to be a little less clear are on the impact on human health, which is actually another part of this rider, I suppose. whenever we've had some high-profile studies come out suggesting links to tumors and so forth. There was that French study last year, but then almost immediately the methodology is challenged. And I mean, no one really. I'm not sure where. I mean, where are we then in the research on the effect of GMO on human health, Tom?
Well, I would say that we're still at a point of great uncertainty. There still to date, we're almost 20 years now into commercialization in the United States of GMO crops, and we've got very few long-term studies. I think it's pretty undeniable that the French study last year had some problems. But one of the things that's interesting about that study is that the researchers were trying to mimic a 90s era Monsanto study. They used the same kind of rats. They had the same sort of protocols. What they basically did was they extended the Monsanto study over more generations, took more time with it, and they found problems. They found, an increase in tumors and things like that. And what that, if the methodology is flawed, then I think what that tells us is we should go back and do more long-term studies and get to the bottom of the problem. The thing about it is that agricultural research in the United States is so dependent on money from these same companies. They basically fund, they massively fund research at private institutions. And also the USDA USDA and federal research dollars just aren't going into safety. I don't have the numbers on me, but a tiny percentage goes into safety, into funding safety studies. So as a result, you've got almost no money to do research, and this scientist in France took a lot of heat, but basically, not super well funded, mimicking a Monsanto study. I think, could not stand before you and say that I think that GMOs definitely cause harm, to human health. But I would say that it's very legitimate to say that there is, uncertainty around the issue, and we need more funding for a study of it.
But this rider would seem to be a continuation, Colin, of a policy of giving the GMO companies the benefit of the doubt that they're doing sufficient testing, I suppose. And how much testing is done before the FDA gives approval to, say, a new GMO crop?
Right. And that's exactly correct, that this is giving the companies benefit of the doubt when actually the FDA doesn't require any safety testing and doesn't conduct any of its own testing. The FDA engages in what's called a voluntary consultation process using the company's data. It's non-public, and the FDA has no authority to reject something because it's a voluntary consultation process. We essentially allow these crops on the market without any testing.
I know certainly proponents of GMO, even they often admit, okay, there might be issues about, the implications of patenting life forms, of market concentration, of, a few companies with all of our seeds, and perhaps the exaggerated claims being made for GM seeds. But when it comes to the science, I'm hearing more and more an argument suggesting that those who question the potential health possibilities of GMO crops are being labeled as anti-science, as sort of Luddites, Tom. I don't know, have you seen this? It's just in the last few years I've seen this. What's your reaction to that, though, that it's the science that you hate, perhaps?
Well, I think it's one thing that I think is really interesting is that this is kind of an untold story about GMOs that Center for Food Safety has actually been great on, and that is that it ends up being a bit of a crude technology. Here we are 20 years into it, and we find that basically there are two serious commercial traits in the market. There's herbicide resistance, and then there's Bt, which is a naturally occurring bacteria that has some toxicity to insects. They've isolated the toxic gene, and they've spliced it in. So you've got corn and a couple of other crops, cotton, that express this toxic gene, that express their own insecticide. These are the only two products that are really on the market, and these next generation products that they're talking about are essentially just sort of ramped up versions of the old ones. And so I would like to turn it around and question whether the science behind GMOs is all that great. And I think that maybe Colin can talk about this a little bit more, but when they mapped the human genome in 2000, they found far fewer genes in human beings than they expected. And I think that it's true that the grape the grapefruit has more genes than the human being. And what that tells us is that the one gene, one trait theory that the whole industry is based on is flawed. It turns out it's a lot more complicated to do anything that is not as simple as herbicide resistance. For example, drought tolerance, or the way that a crop uses nitrogen. These are extremely complex processes that have evolved over literally millions of years. And it turns out that the industry has been promising for a long time now to deliver these sort of miracle drought tolerant or nitrogen efficient crops. And they haven't been able to do it. There's actually a Monsanto drought tolerant crop on the market that the USDA approved, that when the USDA approved it, it acknowledged that it was really no better and maybe not as good as existing strains of corn that are from areas that are drought tolerant. In other words, conventional breeding is actually better at these complex traits than GMO technology.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there, unfortunately. Tom Philpott, thank you very much. Colin O'Neill, thank you. A group called the American Muslims for Palestine has unveiled adverts on parts of New York's transit system that compare Israel's government to South Africa's apartheid regime. The ads also call for a halt to the US government's $3 billion in annual aid to Israel. But the campaign has been criticized by local media groups. One even called it, quote, particularly hateful. The Anti-Defamation League, for its part, also issued a report denouncing the AMP as, quote, extreme. So is the US public ready to hear the Palestinian side of the Middle East conflict? Hatem Bazian is the chairman of the American Muslims for Palestine group. He joins me from San Francisco. Dr. Bazian, what are you trying to achieve with this campaign?
Well, our campaign is intended to draw the attention of the American public into a number of things. One is to really point to the failure of U.S. Foreign policy as it relates to the Palestine-Israel issue. Second, to highlight our continued funding of Israel to the tune of $3 billion, even at a time where we have budget crisis and the sequester. It seems that Israel funding is untouchable, and as such to highlight that we are contributing to the continued intransigence on behalf of Israel vis-a-vis the rights of the Palestinians. And third, which is as important, is to highlight the increasing presence of apartheid structure, a separate structure that is effectively treating the Palestinians in a completely different aspects of legality in the West Bank, but also one can mention in relations to the Palestinians who live in Israel proper.
But was this also a direct reaction to the sort of overtly anti-Muslim poster campaigns that we saw in recent months from various right-wing groups?
Well, it's definitely linked to not keeping the civil society arena, the arena where public discourse takes place, only the domain for individuals who engage in explicit racism and Islamophobia relative to the Muslim population, and using Palestine and the support to Israel as a way to push the envelope of racism, bigotry, and discrimination in this country. And I think in this case, the work of Pamela Geller and her organization really is beyond the pale and uses Islamophobia as a way to highlight and push policies that are distinctively racist in nature.
Your campaign has been dismissed as hateful in some quarters. The Anti-Defamation League had this to say about your group, American Muslims for Palestine. AMP promotes extreme anti-Israel views and has at times provided a platform for anti-Semitism under the guise of educating Americans about, quote, the just cause of Palestine and the rights of self-determination. What's your response to that?
Well, I think the Anti-Defamation League should be defined as Defamation League when it comes to the Israel-Palestine question. The Anti-Defamation League will always try and maintain an almost stealth defense of Israel, and no criticism of Israel will be accepted.
Hatem Bazian, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And that's all from the team in Washington, D.C. for now. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Facebook, where you can find more information about the program. And we want to hear from you. Tell us what stories you want to hear. Share your ideas with us on Twitter. Our handle is AJ Inside Story AM.